Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to talk to you tonight about something that happened just this week, something that the mainstream media is presenting as yet another dangerous provocation by Russia. You've probably seen the headlines: Russian laser attack on British aircraft, Putin tests NATO, dangerous escalation in Scottish waters. But here's the question I want you to ask yourselves tonight, the question that rarely gets asked in our media discourse: what is actually happening here? And more importantly, why is it happening now? Let me start with the facts, because facts matter, even if they're inconvenient. A Russian vessel called the Enter, officially classified as an oceanographic research ship, has been operating in international waters north of Scotland, where it allegedly directed lasers at British Royal Air Force pilots who were monitoring the ship. British Defense Secretary John Healey called this action deeply dangerous and announced that Britain has placed military options on standby. Strong words, serious implications. But let's pause here for a moment and think historically, shall we? Now I want you to imagine for a second what would happen if a Chinese naval vessel were operating off the coast of California, or if Russian spy ships were mapping undersea cables near New York Harbor. Wait, you don't have to imagine that, do you? Because we would call that an act of war. We would have wall coverage denouncing foreign aggression on our shores. But here's what's fascinating. The Yanter has been operating within the UK exclusive economic zone, but in international waters. International waters, let that sink in. This ship is not violating British territorial sovereignty. It's doing exactly what the United States Navy does every single day in the South China Sea, in the Persian Gulf, in the Black Sea. It's operating in international waters, exercising what we in the West love to call freedom of navigation, when it's our ships doing it. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part they don't want you thinking about too carefully. Why is this happening now? Why is a Russian intelligence vessel mapping undersea infrastructure around Britain in November 2025? To answer that question, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture, the economic and geopolitical context that makes this incident not some random act of aggression, but a predictable response to a predictable pattern. Let me take you back. For the past 3 years, the United States and its NATO allies have been engaged in a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. We've sent hundreds of billions of dollars in military equipment. We've trained Ukrainian forces. We've provided intelligence, targeting data, satellite information. And just in recent weeks, we've authorized Ukraine to use advanced Western missile systems to strike deep inside Russian territory. Think about that. We're enabling strikes on Russian soil, hundreds of miles from the Ukrainian border, hitting strategic targets, civilian infrastructure, and yes, potentially nuclear early warning systems. And then we act shocked, absolutely shocked, when Russia responds by mapping our undersea cables and testing our detection capabilities. This is the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of Western foreign policy discourse. We operate as though our actions exist in a vacuum, as though what we do has no consequences, no responses, no blowback. We encircle Russia with NATO bases. We put missile systems in Poland and Romania. We conduct massive military exercises on Russia's borders. We overthrow governments in Ukraine and Georgia that don't align with our interests. And then when Russia responds, when it demonstrates that it too has capabilities, that it too can operate in international waters, that it too can gather intelligence on critical infrastructure, we call it aggression, we call it provocation, we manufacture outrage. Let me be very clear about something. I'm not here to defend laser attacks on pilots. That is dangerous. It's reckless. It puts lives at risk. But let's have the intellectual honesty to recognize that this is how great power competition works. This is what happens when you pursue a foreign policy based on maintaining global hegemony rather than pursuing mutual security. British officials describe this as part of a growing pattern of Russian incursions across NATO territory and a heightened threat environment. But what they don't tell you is that NATO itself has been expanding relentlessly eastward for 3 decades, despite promises made to Soviet leaders that this wouldn't happen. And here's what really interests me as an economist. What are these ships actually looking for? The Enter is designed to monitor and map undersea cables, seabed infrastructure, and other maritime assets that are vital to communication and energy networks. Undersea cables, do you know what percentage of global communications, internet traffic, financial transactions, run through undersea fiber optic cables? Over 95%. These cables are the arteries of global capitalism. They're how money moves, how markets function, how the entire architecture of international finance operates. And in any serious conflict, they become strategic targets. So when Russia maps these cables, it's not engaging in some pointless exercise. It's sending a message: your economic system, your financial networks, your communication infrastructure, they're vulnerable. You want to strike our early warning systems, you want to threaten our strategic depth, fine, but understand that we can threaten the very sinews that hold your economy together. This is deterrence. This is signaling. This is great power politics in the 21st century. It's not pretty. It's not safe, but it's the inevitable consequence of a world order built on American unipolar dominance that's now being challenged by rising and resurgent powers. Now let's talk about the economic dimensions here, because they're crucial and they're being completely ignored in the mainstream coverage. Britain is in serious economic trouble. Its economy has been stagnant since the 2008 financial crisis. Brexit has further constrained its options. It's dealing with inflation, declining living standards, a collapsing healthcare system, and massive inequality. In this context, what does the British government do? It ramps up military spending. It positions itself as America's most loyal lieutenant in the confrontation with Russia. It sends advanced weapons to Ukraine. It hosts American missile systems. Why? Because the British establishment believes that its relevance, its seat at the table of global power, depends on its military relationship with the United States. But here's the cruel irony. Every pound spent on new frigates to chase Russian spy ships is a pound not spent on the National Health Service. Every billion devoted to military modernization is a billion that could have gone to education, infrastructure, green energy transition, anything that might actually improve the lives of ordinary British people. But that's not how the system works. The system works by manufacturing external threats to justify military spending, which enriches defense contractors, which employ former ministers and generals, which donate to political parties, which perpetuate the cycle: follow the money, always follow the money. And speaking of money, let's talk about who benefits from heightened tensions with Russia. The defense industry is having a spectacular few years. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE Systems, they're posting record profits. The war in Ukraine has been a bonanza for weapons manufacturers. Every time there's an incident like this laser attack, stock prices of defense companies tick upward. Contracts get signed, orders get placed. This is what President Eisenhower warned us about in 1961. The military, industrial complex, the intertwining of military and corporate interests that creates a permanent constituency for conflict. Now I can already hear the objections. Professor Wolf, are you saying we should just let Russia do whatever it wants? Should we not defend ourselves? Should we ignore threats to our security? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that security doesn't come from endless confrontation. Security doesn't come from expanding military alliances up to the borders of nuclear powers. Real security, mutual security, comes from diplomacy, from recognizing legitimate security concerns on all sides, from building international institutions that can mediate conflicts, from creating economic interdependence that makes war irrational. But we don't have that system anymore. The post-World War Roman II international order, whatever its flaws, at least maintained channels of communication, forums for negotiation, mechanisms for de-escalation. NATO and the Warsaw Pact talked to each other even during the darkest days of the Cold War. Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated arms reduction treaties. There was a recognition that mutual annihilation served no one's interests. But today we've severed almost all diplomatic contact with Russia. We've imposed unprecedented sanctions. We've frozen dialogue. We've created a situation where incidents like this laser attack have no established channels for resolution, no mechanisms for preventing escalation. This brings me to my central point tonight, and it's one that goes beyond this particular incident. We're living through a transition in the global system. The unipolar moment of American dominance after the Soviet collapse is over. China's rise, Russia's resurgence, the growing independence of countries in the global south, these are irreversible historical trends. The question is, how do we manage this transition? Do we manage it through escalating military confrontations, through proxy wars, through incidents in international waters that could spiral out of control? Or do we manage it through negotiation, through the creation of new international frameworks that reflect current realities rather than the power distribution of 1945 or 1991? The Western establishment, the political and economic elites who benefit from the current system, they've chosen confrontation. They've chosen to try to maintain dominance through military means, but history teaches us that this never works. Declining hegemons that refuse to adjust to new realities, that double down on military solutions, they don't reverse their decline. They accelerate it, they bankrupt themselves, they overextend, they create the very chaos they claim to be preventing. So what should we make of this laser incident? The Russian embassy in London denied targeting Britain's underwater communications or undermining its security, calling Britain's response Russophobic, and claiming it contributes to the further degradation of European security. Now, you can dismiss this as propaganda if you want. But there's a grain of truth here. The degradation of European security isn't happening because of Russian spy ships in international waters. It's happening because we've abandoned diplomacy. It's happening because we've prioritized the interests of defense contractors and geopolitical maximalists over the actual security needs of ordinary people. Think about what real security looks like for average citizens in Britain, or America, or Russia, for that matter. Real security is having a job that pays a living wage. It's having access to health care when you're sick. It's knowing your children will have opportunities in a livable planet. It's not worrying about how you'll pay rent or whether you can afford to heat your home in winter. That's security. That's what matters to people's lives. But instead of investing in that kind of security, our governments invest in weapons systems and military adventures that make us all less safe. And here's the final point I want to leave you with tonight. These tensions, these confrontations, they're not inevitable. They're choices. They're the result of specific policies pursued by specific people with specific interests. And they can be changed, but changing them requires us to think differently about security, about national interest, about how nations should relate to each other in an interdependent world. It requires us to recognize that in the 21st century, with nuclear weapons and climate change and global pandemics, the old models of zero, some competition are suicidal. The laser incident off the coast of Scotland isn't really about lasers. It's about a dying world order refusing to make room for a new one. It's about elites on all sides choosing confrontation over cooperation because confrontation serves their interests even if it threatens ours. It's about the madness of a system where mapping undersea cables gets treated as a greater threat than the collapse of living standards, where military budgets grow while social services shrink, where we sleepwalk toward conflicts that nobody wants but everybody seems powerless to prevent. So yes, the laser incident is concerning. Yes, it's dangerous. But if that's all we focus on, if we don't ask the deeper questions about why it's happening and what alternative paths might exist, then we're just spectators to our own potential destruction. We're letting the architects of this confrontation write the only narrative available, and that's not a position any of us should accept. We need to demand better. We need to demand foreign policies that actually serve the interests of ordinary people rather than defense contractors and geopolitical strategists. We need to demand diplomacy over confrontation, cooperation over dominance, mutual security over hegemony. Will those demands be met immediately? Of course not. The forces invested in the current system are powerful and entrenched. But if we don't even articulate the alternative, if we don't even imagine that a different approach is possible, then we guarantee that nothing will change. We guarantee that incidents like this will keep happening, will keep escalating, until one day an incident goes too far and we find ourselves in a conflict that makes all our other problems look trivial by comparison. So that's my challenge to you tonight. Don't just accept the narrative you're being fed. Don't just react with patriotic outrage when you're told to be outraged. Ask deeper questions, follow the money, understand the history, recognize the pattern, and demand that your leaders pursue policies that actually make you safer rather than policies that make defense contractors richer. Because that's the choice we face, and it's a choice we need to make consciously, not drift into unconsciously. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for thinking critically about these issues. And I hope you'll continue to question, continue to analyze, and continue to demand better from those who claim to act in your interest. That's how change happens. That's how we build a different kind of future. Not through lasers and spy ships and military confrontations, but through citizens who refuse to accept the inevitability of conflict and insist on the possibility of peace. Thank you.